Welcome back to another video in this contest prep series. In today's video, I wanted to discuss a few things. First up, I wanted to discuss my plans for mock peaking and how to peak for a bodybuilding show. Secondly, I wanted to discuss something I don't see discussed that much, which is body image during prep. And finally, I wanted to discuss why I don't plan competing in bodybuilding again for a long time after this show, which is somewhat related to body image during prep. First, my plans for mock peaking and how to peak for a bodybuilding show. So, generally speaking, when peaking for a bodybuilding show, what you're trying to achieve is look leaner and bigger. Now, peaking is different for natural versus enhanced athletes, and there's a lot of cultural beliefs that come with peaking. Like many things in bodybuilding, there's a lot of traditions or practices that have persisted despite not being much evidence for them. For example, for natural athletes, a lot of sodium manipulation or water manipulation probably doesn't make much sense, but it still persisted just because that's part of the culture. But yeah, so I wanted to discuss how to peak for a bodybuilding show. There are a few different types of practices or peaks. There's something called a front load, which is when you start peaking for a show or making nutritional changes earlier in the week. So for example, let's say you're competing on Saturday, you'd start making changes on Monday, whereas in a quote-unquote backload, you'd start making those changes much later in the week, maybe on Thursday or Wednesday even, or sometimes even Friday. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. For example, one advantage of a front load is that you have a bit more time to adjust things. So let's say you overshoot how many carbs you have and you wind up looking pretty spilled over. Spilled over is a term people use to describe when you don't have as much definition and muscle striation and that sort of thing as you did before starting the peak. Likely because there's been an excess of water that's sort of blurring you out a little bit. It's not entirely clear why, but long story short, it happens when your detail and definition decreases a little bit as a result of a peak going a bit wrong. And during a front load, for example, because you have 4 or 5 days to adjust things overall, even if you look a bit spilled over after a couple of days, you still have time to make adjustments to sort of course correct your peak protocol to then come into the show or the photo shoot or what have you looking on point. But then one disadvantage of a front load, and in turn an advantage of a back load, would be that you have less time to actually diet, because obviously if you start making those changes earlier, then you're spending less time in deficit, and so potentially at least you would be slightly less lean than you would be if you did a back load, where you'd be spending maybe an extra 2 to 4 days in a deficit instead. And so each strategy has its benefits and disadvantages. I think for most people it makes sense to do a front load, simply because it's a bit more safe, I guess, or foolproof, because you have more time to adjust things, especially for first-time competitors. But I think a lot of peaking science and peaking effectively comes down to having practiced it before. So because there's not that much actual quote-unquote science or evidence on peaking itself in bodybuilding, you have to go off of mechanistic explanations. So for example, taking in more carbs probably increases muscle glycogen, which then makes your muscles look bigger. So you have to go off of mechanistic explanations in tandem with previous experience on yourself, ideally. And so what I'm doing now is I'm peaking for a few photo shoots and seeing how I respond, taking some pictures, seeing how I respond to days 1 and 2, for example, and see how I respond to the last few days, so I can then have a better plan going into my actual show. And so I think having previous experience or running a mock peak can be really, really useful for making sure your peak goes according to plan when it comes around to actually competing on stage. So for me, I'm doing a front load. The first day is a higher carb day, so I'm having around 110% of maintenance, 115%. I'm going off the Eric Helms peaking protocol, where the first day is a bit higher carb, so around 110% of your maintenance, with the additional calories coming from carbs. Then the next 2 following days being a bit lower than maintenance, around maintenance minus around 500 calories. Then one day with around maintenance, a little bit below maintenance if you're looking a bit spilled over, or a bit above maintenance if you're looking a bit too dry or small, and so forth. And flat, I suppose. And then on the last day, which is competition day, basically just make adjustments based on how you look. So if in the morning of the competition or the photo shoot you look a bit spilled over, try and reduce carbs a little bit, don't overdo it, maybe have around 70% of maintenance calories ish. Whereas if you look quite flat, it might be worth going up to around maintenance, or maybe even slightly above maintenance. But yeah, long story short, I'm starting to peak around 5 days before my photo shoot or competition. The first day is a high carb day, followed by 2 lower carb days, followed by 1 day where I have as many carbs as necessary, depending on whether I look flat or full. And then on the competition day itself, I also adjust based on assessments in the morning, looking at how I look, whether it's more flat or more full, and then go from there. As far as water and sodium goes, not many manipulations, just some extra sodium/salt on the day of the competition or the photo shoot to make sure blood pressure is in check. Basically, when you're in contest prep, blood pressure can drop quite low. For example, my blood pressure has dropped by 10 to 20 points total, both systolically and diastolically. And so I have mild low blood pressure diastolically, and having low blood pressure can be worse for getting a pump. Having a bit higher blood pressure can be helpful, and so having some salt on that day might help with having slightly higher blood pressure and making sure you can actually get a pump. So on the competition day, on the photo shoot day, I'll have some extra salt, around an extra 10 grams of salt total or so. That would be around an extra 4 or 5 grams of sodium. But yeah, that's essentially my peaking strategy. And if you were to do a backload, you'd have more carbs, but on 1 to 3 days instead of 4 to 5 days ahead of time. But most of the other stuff wouldn't change much. But for most people, initially I'd recommend the front load, again, just because it gives you more time to adjust things going into a show or into a photo shoot. But if you have practiced backloading before, and or you've done a mock peak for it, then I think you can safely go ahead and do a backload and be just fine. It's also important to note that peaking does help with how you look for naturals, but it's not going to make that big of a difference, and so the main thing is just actually being fairly lean. So, take it with a grain of salt, pun intended. Next up, I wanted to discuss 2 topics that go hand in hand, so I'll just mention them together now. First one is my body image during prep, and how body image during prep can be an issue. And the second one would be why I don't plan on competing in bodybuilding again for a long time after the show. At this point, competing and preparing for competition has had a pretty major impact on my life. As much as possible, I've tried not to let it. I've tried to focus on other things, on not getting overly hungry and that sort of thing. But at some point, shit just hit the fan. And at this point in prep, you start looking at yourself in the mirror and you're getting worse and worse at judging whether, for example, you're getting leaner, at how you look, and that sort of thing. And I think that's part of the reason why having a coach during contest prep can be quite helpful, is because as you get deeper and deeper into contest prep, you start being less and less objective about a judge of your own appearance. But even beyond just body image, which tends to get worse as you cut and cut and cut, usually, especially when you're competing in bodybuilding, which is a very visual sport. Besides even just body image, my life outside of prep has taken a hit because of prep. So, for example, nowadays it takes me a lot more time to do my steps, so do my daily activity. I'm looking forward to training a lot less. I am thinking about food a lot more, and I can't be as sociable because of having fewer calories to play with, being hungry, and so not wanting to be eating out all the time because I get less satiation from eating out. And so overall, as far as my social life goes, it's made it worse because I'm not able to eat out as much, for example, and because I'm, generally speaking, less fun to be around. Like, that's something a lot of bodybuilders mention, which is prep can damage relationships a little bit because you're just less fun to be around, you're moody, you're irritable, it's just not a very good time. So as far as social life goes, as far as my work life goes as well, just having to do that many steps and training hard and being less energetic, less focused, all that stuff has had a toll on my work as well, whether that's working for my PhD or doing coaching work. So it's just been a lot, and obviously these are the last 6 weeks, and so I expected there to be an impact. But unless I really enjoy the experience of competition itself, I think I'll compete anytime soon again, just because the negative impact that complex prep has had on my lifestyle overall hasn't really been worth the reward. And so I probably will take a few years after this show to just build and be more flexible with dieting, have more emphasis on, getting my training in, building some muscle, but not being crazy lean or not being very, very meticulous with nutrition, just having a more relaxed approach and allowing myself to take a bit more of a focus on other areas of my life, which have suffered during this contest prep. And so I think after this show is over, I'll go back into an off-season for a few years, and as I said, place more of an emphasis on other areas of my life. Just for context, this week of training that you're seeing right now was my last week before my deload, and so that was 1 rep in reserve on everything, and it was hard. It was probably the hardest week of training I've had in a long time. And yeah, prep has also impacted, as I said, my enjoyment in training, and that's a pretty big part of why I lift in the first place. And so going back to the off season and being more relaxed with nutrition is definitely going to be helpful for my enjoyment of training and fitness overall. Anyways, that wraps up this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next one.